Conservatives are calling the Liberals' gun legislation the largest attack on law-abiding hunters in Canadian history. This after an amendment, some hunting rifles and shotguns now appear on a list of what the government is proposing to ban.
Mr. Speaker, even their own backbench are getting the message. Canadians don't want to ban hunters, they want to stop criminals. Will the government get the message?
If the Conservatives were serious about protecting our communities from gun violence, then they would reverse their position, support these measures so we can go after the criminals who've been terrorizing our communities for far too long with guns. Thank you.
Okay, so Prime Minister Justin Trudeau insists they're still consulting with Canadians on this, but Mark Ryckman is the manager of policy at the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. Mark Ryckman, I wonder if you can help me clear up some of the confusion here, because the government says these are assault-style weapons, weapons intended for the battlefield in many cases, but your organization says they're hunting rifles. Why is there such a disconnect here on these weapons?
Yeah, there's a little bit of confusion. Absolutely. I'll be the first to admit it. There are certainly a lot of military style or assault style firearms and weapons of war listed in the amendment that would be prohibited under Bill C-21. However, as a result of the existing or proposed wording of the amendments that were introduced at the Standing Committee a couple of weeks ago, those amendments would greatly expand the scope of the definition of a prohibited firearm under the criminal code, to the point that several models of popular hunting rifles and shotguns would become prohibited if it's adopted as it's currently written.
So let's talk about those hunting rifles if we can. And I will confess to not being a gun expert. I've got people in my family who hunt. I don't do it myself. But can there be a weapon that is a popular hunting weapon, but clearly does fall into a category that police forces and governments might want to say, this is just too dangerous to have in mass circulation? I mean, when you look at the expanded list, are there weapons there that you think the government has a point on, or is this total overreach?
Well, I would argue that everything should be open for debate, or a lot of things should be open for debate. I don't think you're going to find many Canadians that are going to push back against the government's desire to ban mortars and rocket launchers and things like that, and really heavy machine guns and things like that. The concern, certainly among the hunting community recently, is that what I would argue are probably unintended consequences of the wording of the amendment are going to capture some of those popular hunting rifles and shotguns, as you mentioned. The SKS is one. We can talk about, we can debate whether any particular model of firearm should or should not be prohibited and on that list. But the process, I would argue, is part of the problem, in that the amendment was proposed at the Standing Committee, so after second reading, at the point after which individuals and groups like the OFAH would have been able to provide testimony and evidence. So we couldn't do that for the amendment. So if the OFAH had successfully petitioned to provide evidence to the House of Commons, which we were unsuccessful doing, unfortunately, this might have been avoided a little bit. They might have been able to understand where the hunting community concerns are and potentially change the wording of the amendments. But unfortunately, we weren't given that opportunity.
No, and I certainly understand the process concerns. I mean, even the New Democrats, who broadly support the gun legislation, say this is a problematic way to make law and something that they need to speak to the Liberals about. But let's focus on the SKS for an instance, okay? Because that is a very popular rifle. I had Marco Mendicino on the show the other day, and he made very clear that this was a weapon that was intended for the battlefield. Now, it was the battlefields of 75, 80 years ago, not in the AR-15 modern capacity thing. But I understand that's a popular hunting rifle, but is that a necessary hunting rifle? If you look at its deadly capacity, if used in a way that it's not intended for hunting, is this a gun you can make an argument should be on a banned list?
I'm sure some people can make an argument. I think the danger that we get ourselves into is when we start using subjective terms like reasonable for hunting or necessary for hunting. I mean, those are very subjective, and those can be argued, generally end up being argued in a court of law. In fact, a colleague of mine did some research and did author an extensive report on some of the firearm models that would be prohibited under the May 2020 order in council that are actually very reasonable for use in hunting for various reasons, whether they're the appropriate caliber for the game that is being hunted, for instance, if they're efficient at at generating a clean and ethical kill, for instance. So those are the kinds of things that we think of, or we being the OFAH think of when we think about whether or not any particular firearm should be used or is reasonable for hunting. There are some calibers of firearm that are perfectly reasonable for hunting, say, small game, that would not be reasonable for hunting big game like deer or moose, for instance. So I think the problem we get ourselves into is using those subjective terms, ignoring sort of the form and function of some of these firearm types, and focusing probably a little bit too much on whether or not something was originally created for the battlefield, like an old musket, for instance. I mean, those were generally designed for war, obviously, but you wouldn't send any soldier into a modern day battlefield with a muzzle loader, for instance.
No, not with any hope, anyway. But you mentioned you mentioned the SKS and some of these more powerful weapons that you want it for the stopping power, for the clean, ethical kill, because you don't want to wound a moose and have it run off into the woods and die slowly and bleed out. But surely there would be alternative weapons or rifles that hunters could switch to if some of these, like these are not the only option out there, correct?
Yeah, let's be very clear that this legislation, including the amendments that were proposed at the standing committee, are not intended to, and as worded, they are not going to eliminate all common and reasonable hunting rifles and shotguns in Canada. That is not the case. The concern that we have is that we were told that by the government repeatedly that they would not be coming after hunters, and for the most part, they didn't until the amendments were proposed at the standing committee stage. And as you've alluded to, and as you've spoken to various guests on your show, there are clearly some reasonable hunting firearms that are proposed to be prohibited on this list.
So help me with the compromise then at this point, because if they're not going to redo the process and have you come in and testify in expertise, is there a way to amend this list in unofficial consultation with groups like yours, where you can get to, where they can get the expanded level of public safety they're looking for, but hunters can still have the flexibility they need to carry out their sport or subsistence hunting in a way that's safe and reasonable for you? I mean, does that compromise path exist?
Well, we would hope so. So we would argue that you're right. The process has been a little bit problematic so far, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity for some of that more informal consultation. Obviously, the standing committee's job is to do a clause-by-clause review of the bill and proposed amendments and propose recommendations for change. So the OFAH has a reputation for being very reasonable and constructive and working very well with all political parties at all levels of government. And we will continue to work with this government and MPs from all parties to develop policies and legislation that respects the hunting community across Canada, while also advancing the government's commitment to restrict certain kinds of weapons in the hands of Canadians.
So just a final question, Mr. Ryckman. The Prime Minister said earlier this week they're listening to concerns from hunters. They may be willing to open to change. You've referenced this. I mean, how sincere do you take that? Do you really get the sense that the government is willing to do this? Because when the politicians are arguing about it, they all dig in. But what is your sense as the end point of the consequence of this legislation?
Well, let's put it this way. The OFAH is going to take the Prime Minister at his word and hold his feet to the fire and ensure that he follows through on his commitment to listen to the hunting community concerns and do our best to engage, like I said, with MPs from all parties to ensure that those concerns are heard and that we make constructive and reasoned and evidence-based recommendations for change.
Okay. Mark Ryckman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.